The flight attendant's voice was crisp, final, and utterly devoid of warmth. "I'm sorry, sir, but this seat has been reassigned." He simply nodded. Later, a four-star general would call that single sentence an act of profound national ignorance. But at that moment, 88-year-old John Miller was just a man being told he didn't belong. The journey had begun with a quiet sense of purpose. John Miller, a veteran of 2 wars, stepped onto the aircraft with a first-class ticket clutched in a hand weathered by time and hardship. He was headed to Washington, D.C. for a ceremony honoring the few remaining members of his old unit, an occasion steeped in memory and ghosts. His attire was humble, a simple tweed jacket over a pressed shirt, worn but clean trousers, and a faded military cap that sat on his head not as a statement, but as a part of him. It was a relic of a life lived in service, its insignia dulled by decades of sun and rain. He made his way through the hushed, sterile world of the first-class cabin, a place of plush leather seats, complimentary champagne, and the murmur of quiet privilege. Finding his seat, 2A, he felt a brief moment of relief. The legroom would be a small mercy for knees that still ached from a long-ago parachute jump over Normandy, and a back that had carried fallen comrades through the frozen hills of Korea. He began to lower himself into the seat, the gentle sigh of the cushion a welcome promise of comfort for the long flight ahead. That's when she appeared. A flight attendant with a practiced, polished smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. "Excuse me, sir," she said, her tone professionally placid. "Are you Mr. Miller?" John straightened up, his movements slow but deliberate. "Yes, that's me." She glanced at a tablet in her hand, then back at him, her gaze sweeping over his simple clothes and aged cap. A flicker of something, perhaps impatience or judgment, crossed her face before being smoothed away. "We've had to reassign this seat due to an operational requirement." The corporate jargon was a neat, sterile wall hiding the simple truth of the matter. Someone else, someone deemed more important, was getting his seat. John looked from her impassive face to the seat he had paid for, then back again. He wasn't a man given to confrontation. His life had been defined by duty, by following orders, by enduring without complaint. He could have shown her his ticket, could have pointed out the confirmation email, but he saw in her eyes that it wouldn't matter. The decision had already been made. "We have a new seat for you in the main cabin. Row 34, seat B, if you'll just follow me." And so, John began the long, quiet walk from the front of the plane to the back. It was a gauntlet of averted gazes and feigned ignorance, each step a small, sharp humiliation. He passed the spacious seats, the clinking glasses, the relaxed smiles of people living in a world he had helped build, but in which he no longer seemed to fit. The sting of disrespect was a familiar ache, duller than a bullet wound, but in some ways more persistent. He finally reached row 34, a cramped middle seat in the bustling economy section. He stowed his small carry-on bag, the one containing his dress uniform for the ceremony, and squeezed into the narrow space. The engines began to whine, the cabin lights dimmed, and the plane prepared for takeoff. John leaned his head back against the uncomfortable seat, the faded fabric rough against his cheek. He closed his eyes, not in anger, but in a quiet, bone-deep weariness. What no one on that plane knew, what the flight attendant with her plastic smile could never have guessed, was that they had just dismissed a man who carried a silver star for valor in his pocket, a man who had once held the fate of thousands in his weathered hands. The seat was a cage of unforgiving angles. John settled into the cramped space, his knees pressed firmly against the seat in front of him,
a stark contrast to the promised comfort of 2A. Dignity, he had learned long ago, was not a matter of circumstance, but of bearing. So he complied without a word, his silence a shield against the indignity of the moment. He adjusted his cap, his gaze distant, his posture as erect as the narrow confines would allow. His eyes drifted toward the front of the plane, where the curtains separating the cabin swayed with the aircraft's movement, offering brief glimpses into the world he had just been exiled from. He saw the relaxed posture of the young professionals, their world illuminated by the blue glow of laptops and smartphones. He saw the effortless comfort they took for an entitlement, something given rather than earned. And in that moment, John couldn't help but feel the immense, crushing weight of his past. It wasn't anger that filled him, but a profound and sorrowful nostalgia. The ache in his back was more than just age. It was a living ledger of his service, a reminder of nights spent on frozen ground in Korea, the memory of carrying a wounded brother 2 miles through enemy territory. His knees, protesting with every shift of his weight, held the echoes of 1,000 marches, of scaling cliffs under fire, of kneeling in prayer beside friends who would never rise again. These weren't just aches and pains, they were ghosts. Ghosts of battles fought, of promises kept, of a world that seemed to have forgotten the price of its own peace. Beside him, a young woman in her 20s, Sarah, kept glancing over. She had her headphones in, but something about the old man's quiet stillness drew her attention. He hadn't complained or argued. He had simply accepted his demotion with a grace that seemed out of place in the modern world of asserted rights and vocal complaints. He seemed to belong to a different time, a different code.
As John shifted slightly, trying to find a less painful position, his jacket parted. For a brief second, the cabin light caught on something tucked neatly into his shirt pocket. Sarah saw a faint glint of silver and enamel, the edge of a star-shaped metal attached to a ribbon of faded blue and white. To her, it was just a piece of old metal, a curious trinket, perhaps from a long-ago school achievement or a social club. She couldn't know she was looking at the Silver Star, the nation's 3rd highest award for valor in combat. She saw an old man in a cheap seat. She did not see the hero sitting beside her. But her curiosity was piqued, a small seed of inquiry planted in the fertile ground of her conscience. She watched him for a moment longer as he closed his eyes, his weathered face a mask of stoic endurance. He said nothing. For men of his generation and of his core, you bore your burden. You did not announce it. Sarah couldn't shake the image of the old man's quiet dignity. It was a stark contrast to the casual cruelty of his displacement. On impulse, driven by a nagging sense that something was deeply wrong, she pulled out her phone. Her brother, Adam Thompson, was a lieutenant in the U.S. Navy, currently stationed in Norfolk. He was her touchstone for all things military, the keeper of a code of honor she admired but didn't fully understand. Tapping out a quick message under the dim cabin lights, she tried to be discreet. "Hey, weird situation on my flight. They just moved an old vet from first class to economy. He's sitting next to me. Name is John Miller. He's got some kind of old star-shaped metal in his pocket. Just feels wrong." She didn't expect an immediate reply. Adam was likely on duty. But her phone buzzed less than a minute later, the vibration startlingly urgent. "Sarah, are you serious? John Miller? Silver Star? Get a picture if you can. Do not be obvious." The intensity of his response sent a jolt of alarm through her. She risked a quick angled photo of John's pocket, capturing the corner of the metal and the faded fabric of his shirt, and sent it. The reply came back instantly, a rapid-fire series of texts that made her heart pound. "Confirmed. That's the Silver Star. Sarah, do you have any idea who you're sitting next to?" Before she could type a response, another message came through. "That's not just any soldier. That's Master Sergeant John Miller. He's a legend. The files on him are sealed tighter than a drum, but everyone in special operations knows his name. He didn't just serve, he fundamentally changed the outcome of battles." Sarah's face went pale. A cold wave of guilt washed over her as she stared at the unassuming man sleeping beside her, his head resting against the vibrating window. She had watched him be humiliated, had done nothing, had thought nothing of it. Her own inaction felt like a betrayal. Another text arrived, and this one made her breath catch in her throat. During Desert Storm, his unit was ambushed, hopelessly outnumbered. Official story is they were wiped out. The real story: Miller single-handedly held off an entire enemy platoon for 12 hours, protecting a compromised intelligence asset. That asset had information that prevented a chemical weapons attack planned on 3 Allied battalions. He saved thousands of lives that day. Thousands! And the airline put him in a middle seat.
The words on her screen burned with Adams' fury, an indignation that now mirrored her own. The polite, corporate dismissal by the flight attendant, the indifferent glances of the other passengers, her own passive silence, it all coalesced into a single, unbearable act of disrespect. This wasn't just poor customer service. It was a desecration. A fire ignited within her. This would not stand. Her family had deep roots in the military community. Her father had served for 30 years, and their social circle was a constellation of service members, active and retired. She knew people who could move mountains with a single phone call. Scrolling through her contacts, her thumb hovered over one name: General Charles Adams. A 4-star general, a friend of her father's, and a man who commanded with the force of a moral hurricane. She hesitated for only a second, then typed a message, her fingers flying across the screen with newfound purpose. General Adams, my apologies for the intrusion. I am on Flight 217 to D.C. A national hero, Silver Star recipient Master Sergeant John Miller, has just been publicly dishonored by the airline staff. I believe you know him. The situation requires immediate attention. She hit send. The message shot out into the ether, a quiet act of rebellion launched from row 34. Now, all she could do was wait. The response was not a text message. It was a tremor that ran through the entire aircraft. The plane had just been pushed back from the gate, the engines spooling up with a deep, resonant hum, when a sudden, jarring lurch brought it to a halt. The pilot's voice crackled over the intercom, tight with confusion and a hint of alarm. Ladies and gentlemen, this is the captain speaking. We are experiencing an unexpected operational delay at the gate. Please remain in your seats. We've been instructed to hold our position by airport ground control. An uneasy murmur rippled through the cabin. Annoyed sighs and frustrated glances were exchanged. But the collective impatience froze into stunned silence when the jet bridge, which had just been detached, began to move back toward the plane, reconnecting with a solid, authoritative thud. The cabin door, which had been sealed for departure, was unlatched from the outside. It swung open not to reveal a smiling gate agent, but a wall of military discipline. Flanked by a dozen soldiers in immaculate dress uniforms who filed in to secure the entrance, a man stepped onto the plane whose very presence seemed to alter the air pressure in the cabin. He was tall and broad-shouldered, his face a roadmap of command decisions made in harsh sunlight and under immense pressure. The 4 silver stars gleaming on each of his shoulders identified him as a full general. This was General Charles Adams, and he moved with the unyielding force of a man accustomed to having the world bend to his will. The atmosphere on the plane shifted in an instant. The low hum of chatter died, replaced by a silence so profound you could hear the soft whir of the ventilation system. Laptops were snapped shut. Phones were lowered, every eye in first class, then business, then the entire economy cabin was fixed on the uniformed figures at the front. The flight attendant who had dismissed John approached, her professional smile now a strained, nervous mask. "Sir, I'm sorry, but boarding is complete. You can't be on the—" "I am General Charles Adams," he interrupted, his voice not loud but carrying the weight of absolute authority that cut through the sterile cabin air like a razor. "This aircraft is not departing until I have a word with your captain and your chief purser. And you," he said, his gaze locking onto the flight attendant, "are going to tell me precisely why a recipient of the Silver Star was removed from his designated seat on my authority."
The flight attendant's composure shattered, the blood drained from her face, and her corporate training offered no script for this scenario. A seating issue, sir. There was an overbooking." "I am not interested in your seating issues," the general stated, his voice dropping to a low, dangerous growl that resonated with pure, controlled fury. He took a step forward, his polished boots silent on the carpet. "I am interested in why one of this nation's highest decorated combat veterans was treated with the kind of disrespect that I wouldn't tolerate for a raw recruit in basic training. Now, where is he?" Sarah, who had been watching the scene unfold with a mixture of terror and vindication, felt an overwhelming sense of responsibility. She unbuckled her seatbelt and stood, her voice trembling slightly as she spoke into the charged silence. "He's back here, sir, in row 34. General Adams' eyes found her, and he gave a single sharp nod of acknowledgement before turning his attention back to the aisle. He began to walk, his entourage of soldiers remaining at the front like silent, unmovable sentinels. His progress was a slow, deliberate procession through a sea of stunned faces. Passengers craned their necks, their earlier indifference replaced by a mixture of awe and dawning shame. The general walked past the spacious first-class seats, his gaze sweeping over the occupants who now shrank from his view. He passed the curtain into the main cabin, his presence turning the narrow aisle into a stage. He finally stopped at row 34, his large frame filling the space, casting a shadow over the seats. John had been awakened by the commotion, his eyes now open and alert, taking in the impossible scene before him. He recognized the face, aged by time but still carrying the same fire he remembered from a dusty command tent decades ago. General Adams' expression softened as he looked down at the old man. The thunder of his command voice was gone, replaced by a tone of profound, unwavering respect. "John," he said, his voice clear and firm, echoing through the silent cabin. "It's Charles Adams. On your feet, Sergeant." He then amended the command, his voice softening further. "John Miller, I demand that you come with me." It was a commander's order, but it was layered with a plea of a friend and the deference of a soldier to a hero. "You will not spend one more second in this seat." For a long moment, John Miller did not move. He simply looked at the four-star general standing before him, a specter from a lifetime ago. Then, a spark of the old discipline, buried but never extinguished, took hold. With a slow, deliberate motion that defied his 88 years, he pushed himself up. He was no longer a dismissed passenger. He was a soldier rising to a command. The entire cabin held its breath, watching in a heavy, reverent silence. General Adams placed a steadying hand on John's shoulder, a gesture not of assistance, but of solidarity. He then turned and began to lead the way back to the front of the plane. The walk was a powerful inversion of John's earlier journey. Where before there had been averted eyes and quiet contempt, there was now a sea of wide, stunned, and deeply ashamed faces. The silence was absolute, broken only by the soft footfalls of the two veterans on the carpeted aisle. It was a procession of honor, a public restoration of a dignity that should never have been questioned. Upon reaching the first-class cabin, General Adams did not immediately let John take his seat. Instead, he stopped, turned to face the entire plane, and let his gaze sweep across every passenger. His voice, when he spoke, was not the angry bark of a commander, but the clear, resonant tone of a history teacher giving a lesson that would never be forgotten. "For those of you who witnessed what happened here today," he began, his voice commanding the attention of every soul on board, "I want you to understand what you saw. You saw a man who has given more to this country than most of us could ever imagine. You saw a man wearing a silver star." He paused, letting the weight of the words sink in. "That medal isn't given for participation.
It is awarded for gallantry in action against an enemy of the United States, for singular, life-threatening heroism. He gestured toward John. During a mission in the Gulf War that remains classified to this day, Master Sergeant Miller's unit was compromised. He held the line when no one else could. His actions that day directly saved the lives of thousands of soldiers and civilians. He fought for the very freedoms you enjoy, the freedom to conduct your business, to travel, to live your lives in peace, blissfully unaware of the sacrifices made on your behalf. His eyes settled on the first-class cabin. This man is not looking for a handout. He is not asking for your pity. He is owed your respect. He then gently guided John toward seat 2A. He has earned his place at the front of this plane. He has earned his place in the history of this nation. As John finally settled into the plush leather seat, a single passenger began to clap. It was a hesitant, solitary sound in the thick silence. Then another joined, and another, until the entire plane, from the front row to the very back, erupted in a wave of thunderous applause. It was more than a polite gesture. It was a collective apology, a standing ovation of gratitude and shame.
John simply nodded, his eyes glistening slightly as he looked out the window. He reached into his pocket, and his fingers closed around the cool metal of his medal, a private communion with a lifetime of duty. Sarah stood near the aisle, tears streaming down her face, tears of guilt for her own silence, and of overwhelming gratitude for the justice she had just witnessed. The plane finally took off into the evening sky, its atmosphere fundamentally transformed. The flight attendants, their faces pale and etched with regret, came to offer their deepest apologies. John accepted with a quiet nod, his grace making their transgression feel even greater. The journey continued in a state of humbled reflection. Before they landed, General Adams made a call from his satellite phone. The conversation with the airline CEO was brief, icy, and non-negotiable. The fallout was immediate. The next day, the airline announced a new company-wide policy, effective immediately, the Miller Protocol. It guaranteed automatic upgrades and premier treatment for all decorated veterans, ensuring that what happened to John Miller would never again happen. Deeply moved, Sarah found her calling in the event. She began volunteering for veterans organizations, dedicating her life to ensuring that the stories of heroes like John were told and that their dignity was never again left to the whims of corporate policy or public indifference. She had learned that respect isn't a transaction, it's a debt owed to those who paid a price we can never fully repay.